Well, welcome. Today we're going to talk about John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Um, it's interesting to us on its face, and of course it's interesting to us because of the news too. Now, it's reasonable to expect that the government's going to want to limit free speech during wartime. In World War II, for example, Congress passed a law limiting free speech, which resulted in Eugene Debs, the leader of the American Socialist Party, being jailed for violating the 1917 Espionage Act. The first time that the U.S. government sought to silence opposition to a warlike situation was during the presidency of John Adams. He was the second president of the United States. Now, Adams took the rap for the act, but he wasn't alone in his opinion that talking against the government's actions should be against the law. In fact, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and the bulk of the Federalist Party agreed that the country should quietly stand behind the wishes of the executive and legislative branches of government in times of conflict. The circumstances of this particular act and the reaction to passing the legislation were in many ways unique, but it might not surprise you that it was in large part about politics and about political parties. Now, Adams, as a person, wasn't really liked by very many people. He was a bit righteous about his government service, and he and his fellow New Englanders just kind of felt like they were right about everything. You could say he wasn't exactly a warm and fuzzy teddy bear. So let's begin looking at what the two acts did. And now here's the alien part of the acts. Remember, everyone who's not of First Nations origins, like the Delaware, the Cherokee, and the other people who were here when the Europeans first showed up, were either immigrants or they were from immigrant stock. And so here's a couple of parts here. Number one, the Naturalization Act. How long does it take to be able to be a naturalized citizen? It increased the time that you would spend in the U.S. from 7 years to 14 years before you could be eligible for citizenship. The Enemy Aliens Act portion of these bills allowed for the president to deport anyone from a nation who was at war with the United States. It kind of, in our day, just based upon the newspaper, it does kind of ask the question, or you might ask the question, is our country at war with another country when there's a declaration? So that would be an important thing. And then the last part here that I want to take a look at in this particular place is that the president, the Alien Friends Act, the president was granted the right to deport any alien he felt was dangerous. So he could just be walking down the street, look at somebody and say, you're out of here. It was passed on July the 14th, which was the anniversary of the beginning of the French Revolution. And this is important because this is all about the French Revolution, the bill, the way it came about, and the circumstances, and that's what we're going to talk about here. It expired, though, this particular part, it expired on March the 3rd, 1801. So it's no longer law. The president, regardless who he is, and someday is she, the president just can't walk down the road or look on social media or check the news feeds or whatever, and say, I'm deporting you because I think you're dangerous. Now, the second part here, the Sedition Act. Sedition means to talk against the government. That's the definition of the word. And so this particular act authorized the punishment of any person who authored or printed false, scandalous, and malicious writing. So basically, if you wrote or you were the printer who printed something that disagreed with the government, then this was written specifically for you. So any person who authored or printed false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the Congress or the president, and if the intention was to defame or bring them, or either of them, that is to say Congress or the president, into contempt or disrepute, or if it was designed to excite anything against them and the hatred of the good people of the United States. So what this is really about is this is about the opposition writing things in a newspaper that was then printed, designed to disagree with what John Adams and the Third Congress was doing. Now, historians, part of their training and part of what they get really good at is looking for things that aren't on the page. You know, you and I, over our careers, depending upon how that went, depending upon what you did, you can kind of, we learn to read between the lines. You know, what are they really getting at? And this isn't exactly that. This is one of those situations where looking for what's missing is going to be all the difference. So if we look up here, we'll see it says scandalous and malicious writing against Congress or the president, which are the parties that were responsible for the policy against the French, which is what we're going to get into in just a moment here. But you may have noticed that that it excludes the vice president. Now, this is important in its situation because the Constitution before the 12th Amendment simply stated that the highest vote getter from the Electoral College would become the president, and the second highest would be chosen as the vice president. Remember, it's not the people that elect the president, it's the Electoral College. The Electoral College meets once, they cast their votes for the presidential candidates, and then they disband. And then 4 years later, a newly constituted Electoral College meets, they cast their votes, and then they disband again. Members of the Electoral College in that day were not necessarily tied to the people voting. They may have been appointed by the governor or the legislature, and they didn't have any commitment in those days to mirror what the popular vote might be. So it's a little bit different. But the point here is that the highest vote getter became the president. The second highest vote getter became the vice president. The founders did this on purpose because they wanted a government that didn't have any political parties. The political parties aren't mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. And the founders were united in seeking not to reproduce the kind of trouble in Parliament between the Whigs and the Tories. It was exactly that give and take that created the revolution in the first place. If you go back, for example, and you read the Declaration of Independence, the center part where Thomas Jefferson accuses the king of doing things, every line starts with "he has." While it's true that the king established the government and the government was in line with what the king wanted to do, it was really Parliament that was doing most of those things. You might want to take a look someday. So their concept, though, was that good men of high moral character would decide to step away from their business and their livelihood and serve their country for a season. And then after that season was over, they would return to their lives and businesses and move along. Probably, it seems to me anyway, the best example of that in our era would be Jimmy Carter. He left his peanut farm, worked in the government, and then when he ended his career in the government as the president, when Ronald Reagan defeated him, then he went back to his peanut farm, which was in terrible shape. It took him some time to make his peanut farm profitable again. And of course, you receive, if you're the president, you receive the salary for being president your entire life. But that wasn't his thing. So he made his peanut farm work again, and then based upon that, he was able to do some of the other absolutely amazing things that he did. Jimmy Carter was perhaps the best ex-president that we ever had. It's pretty amazing. So by rejecting the idea that opposing parties would spend their time and energy working against each other, the founders hoped to create a government that had the highest civil intentions. But unfortunately, The second administration put a Federalist in the presidential office, that was John Adams, and a non-Federalist in the vice presidential office, that was Thomas Jefferson. The origin and the development of political parties during this era is a direct consequence of the Alien and Sedition Acts, because Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans were the targets of the laws in the first place. Now, the situation that started this was the French Revolution. It created a crisis that the Alien and Sedition Acts specifically targeted. The French Revolution and its aftermath established a continental-wide 100-year peace, even as it sowed the seeds for the Great War, you probably know it as World War I, and the democracies in the early 20th century. As Americans, just as a little background about the French Revolution, as Americans, we think we know how revolutions are supposed to go. The home population or the people revolt against an evil government with grit and a little luck. The people win and they start a new government, plan, action, success. But that's not how it usually goes, and that's certainly not the way that it went in France. In France, somewhat inspired, you could maybe even say some of the aristocracy, certainly General Washington's aide, Lafayette, were drunk on the idea of democracy led by the people that was successful in the United States. And on July the 14th, 1789, the citizens of France in Paris stormed an old fort and jail called the Bastille. It was in protest of high food prices and a monarchy that just seemed completely unconcerned about the lives of ordinary citizens. You may recall, it's kind of in popular culture, that some aides come to the Queen, Marie Antoinette, and they say, "Oh, my Queen, the people are starving." And she is so disconnected from the people and the fact that it's hard to even get bread on a daily basis that she turns to her aide and says, "Well, then let them eat cake." That's probably an apocryphal story and not true, but it does illustrate the extreme difference between the monarchy and how they were living and the regular people on the street there. Some of the aristocrats, like the Marquis de Lafayette, who, like I said, was one of General Washington's aides, pushed for the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic along the lines of the U.S. After a brief turn at governing, though, this group of aristocrats, it didn't go too well, and the revolution quickly turned to terror. As a part of that group called the Directory, decided that if you weren't for what they wanted to do, you were plotting against them. And in a way to be more efficient to murder the people who spoke against the government, they set up the guillotines and beheaded any and all in opposition to the Directory's main leader. His name was Robespierre. Here's a picture, an artist's drawing of the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille was a medieval fort. The Ancien regime was so crooked that some of the guards on the fort actually turned and joined the rioters to help them find and take some ammunition and guns to fight the government. And that's what you see here. This is the origin. This is French Independence Day, July the 14th. Now, Thomas Jefferson, who was not only the writer of the Declaration of Independence, but also the ambassador to France and would become the third president of the United States, he was enamored by the French people and culture. He absolutely loved France. He loved the people. He loved the little celebrity that he was when he was there. He loved the salons where the philosophers talked about important philosophy and government and other things. He was also aware that without French help, our revolution may well have failed. In fact, it probably would have. The French committed not only a substantial sum of money, but also ships and soldiers. But Thomas Jefferson didn't like monarchies, and he didn't care what stripe they came from. He didn't like the British, of course. He had special animosity for King George, but he didn't like French kings or Austrian kings or any other kings. It didn't help Thomas Jefferson that the Jay Treaty, which was signed when he was the vice president, which was designed to tie up some of the loose ends from the Revolution. Some of the agreements in the Treaty of Paris were either a little bit sloppy or really the British just didn't want to do what they agreed to do. And so John Jay was sent over and he cleaned some things up. Thomas Jefferson didn't like it. It seemed to Jefferson and some of the people in his circle, James Madison and some others, that it favored Britain over the U.S. And so when he found out there was a French Revolution to depose King Louis XVI, he was all for it. He supported the French people because he drew a line between the French king and the French people. And he thought the U.S. government should back him up too. He was backed by the treaty with France that outlined that the U.S. should help provide in the event that the British should start something. So his idea was that there was a treaty that was signed between France and the United States, and that's why the French agreed to help the United States, and that we should then come to France's aid. It was a bilateral treaty, and so the enemy of my enemy is also my enemy, and that was the situation. So the question, though, between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, basically between the Federalists, Adams and Hamilton, and Washington was in that group, between the Federalists and those who they're not a political party yet, they're about to become a political party. The party is going to be called the Democratic Republicans. And so the question between them was, did America owe France its help? Now, it gets a little complicated because in Jefferson's mind, he argued that the agreement was between countries. And they had two countries. There was the United States, which was a country, and there was France, which was a country. Hamilton, who, by the way, was kind of enamored with the British monetary system and general form of government, argued the treaties were between governments. Now, what he meant by that is that if the French overthrew or deposed the king and there was a change of government, then the bilateral treaty between the United States and the French was null and void because the king, Louis XVI, was no longer the government. Now the Directory was the government. And so he said, nope, the treaty is null and void. Whereas, as I said, Jefferson said, no, it's France and it's the United States. You could look at that as a geographic thing. The new government under the Marquis de Lafayette drafted a document that looked amazingly like the Declaration of Independence. It was called the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Thomas Paine was in that group, the author of Common Sense. Marquis de Lafayette was there. They wrote this Declaration of Rights for the aristocracy and the common man. It was both a statement of principle and it was also the beginnings of a government. The government didn't last very long, and it was, as I mentioned a moment ago, replaced by a group called the Directory. We're looking at our points here. Like I said before, the French helped turn the tide. The deposing of the king put these old two adversaries at war again. France demanded that we give what we got, a quid pro quo. I did this, you do that. But the U.S. was still in a pretty difficult spot trying to establish itself on the world stage. And so it could hardly afford, either from a budget standpoint or no political clout, to get into war with any country, and especially the British, who had the largest navy on the planet. And there's a good body of scholarly work that says that the War of 1812 is the actual final end of Britain's looking at the colonies as something they could take back. When the War of 1812 is settled, then they finally kind of turn their face and they decide they're not going to do that anymore. Now, the immediate reaction to the Directory wresting control of the government and beheading the king and his Austrian bride, Marie Antoinette, was a declaration of war by a coalition of other countries that included Britain. Their very way of life was at stake, after all. God himself had established the right of kings to rule. Just ask the kings. Power to and by the people would surely result in more heads rolling, according to the French example. You could say the animosity between the English and the French, which had dated back to the Middle Ages, was not dependent on the king, but instead on the country, its name and location. And so the French, pressuring the Americans to join their side, dropped all the trade restrictions with their Caribbean colonies, and American merchant ships, even as the Directory began the bloodbath known as the Reign of Terror. Knowing that they would fight the British on both land and sea, the French began to impress American sailors at will. Impressment is if you see another ship on the horizon, you go up to them and you take the sailors off the ship that you think are from your country, and you make them serve in your own navy. And so they got themselves into this not really war, a quasi-war, a fake war, an almost war. You can call it whatever you want to call it. And it was really about these three things: impressment of American sailors. Now, basically speaking, in this era, if you could get to the United States and call yourself an American, then you were an American. Remember, we looked where the time that you spent in the country was raised from 7 years to 14 years. But people from all over Europe came to the U.S. So it was never a problem for the Spanish or the Portuguese or the French or the British to board an American ship and find people who were of their nationality, because that was the nature of the United States. The fight was about restrictions on trade, and then, of course, the fight was about the Directory, which had become very, very radical. Now, the French, of course, were looking for monetary support to fight this first coalition, Britain, Austria, some others, and they began talks for monetary and material support. You know, you give us ammunition, etc. The old way of diplomacy was to pay the diplomats for their service as they acted on behalf of their country. To the Americans, though, this payment was simply a bribe, and they refused to pay a bribe. A series of letters demanding the bribe was released to the public, which turned the sympathetic Americans against the French government. This was known as the XYZ affair, because the names of the diplomats seeking bribes were withheld. They were simply called person X, Y, and Z. The American population suddenly went from being in favor of the French to against them. And they sided with Adams and the Adams administration in seeking to remain neutral in the conflict, and requested allow them to trade with both sides. That's what Adams wanted to do, and not get caught up between the winners and the losers. Now, it was this climate, of course, this turning from the XYZ affair, that set up the opportunity for Congress to pass and the president to sign the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, of course, the Americans were poorly prepared to wage any war. Earlier, pirates in the Mediterranean had attacked and confiscated American cargo at will. Small gunboats protected the large coast of the U.S., but nothing was really worthy of a seagoing voyage or confrontation with a true ship of the line. As vice president, Adams had overseen the creation of a fleet of 6 frigates, barely able to defend the American coastline from British harassment, let alone any global conflicts. The frigates were the beginning of the world's most powerful navy. The United States ship Constitution, by far the most famous of those frigates, also known as Old Ironsides, is the longest serving active military warship in the U.S. Navy. Impressment by both English and French ships would continue to be an issue, though, until the end of the War of 1812. Now, I've established the international crisis that set up the wheels in motion for the Alien and Sedition Acts. The French Revolution created a demand for American support, but the revolution itself was in flux as one government was toppled by another in an attempt to settle on a replacement for the monarchy. As you can imagine, many French and especially members of the aristocracy who were specifically targeted during the Reign of Terror sailed over to the friendly land across the Atlantic and settled in America. As a result, there was a growing French community in the U.S., kind of like the Cuban refugees in Florida who fled the Castro regime. The first administration of the new government was easy, the Washington administration. The Constitution directed the highest vote getter would be the president, the second highest the vice president, and implicit in the ratification of the Constitution was the understanding that Washington was going to be the first president. Adams, who became the vice president, had been part of the independence process from the beginning, and so there they were. According to the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, 7 states permitted popular voting for the Electoral College in the election. In the remaining 9 states, though, state legislatures elected the members of the Electoral College. So the second administration went to John Adams, a Federalist in that he was a supporter of the Constitution as opposed to supporting the Articles of Confederation, which was the first government we had. The final count was 71 for Adams and 68 for Jefferson. And as I mentioned before, there were no political parties at the time. Later, the 12th Amendment would assure this didn't happen again, and it laid out separate votes for the president and vice president. You couldn't run for both. You had to pick one. Subsequently, now, as you know, the president and vice president run on the same ticket. A person running for one office couldn't run for the other. The Constitution, as I mentioned before, is purposely silent about the parties because the founders just thought we could have one big happy family. Jefferson, though, quickly found that he disagreed with many of the policies in the Adams administration. Specifically, Adams's stand on the French Revolution and all the French emigres entering the country. This situation brought about the first major political crisis of our newly formed government. How does a person or group of persons object to the current administration while supporting the Constitution and form of government? Now, there was already a growing mistrust of the members in what would become the Federalist Party. Jefferson had enlisted the help of his friend James Madison to spread their growing point of view that Adams, Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton of the musical fame, and others in that camp were enamored with the British system of government. In fact, Adams, for his part, thought the only way to ensure consistency in the government in the long term was to have some kind of inherited ruler. But perhaps the single branch of the emerging government that brought Jefferson and Madison together was the Treasury and the monetary system of Alexander Hamilton. I don't think it's a stretch to say that Hamilton was a genius. His ability to hold things in his head and put them together in a coherent way speaks to the multiple tracks in his mind and could keep the whole thing, could hold them all together. The issue between Hamilton and Jefferson was Hamilton's Department of the Treasury and the National Bank. Now, Hamilton, you see, had a plan. It included federal taxes on citizens, and it mashed up the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, capital for sustained future growth, and sustainability in emerging financial markets. It was called the National Bank. Jefferson and Madison, though, weren't the only ones to object to the power it gave to the already rich financial people, mostly centered in Philadelphia and New York City. People who had enough money and enough property that they had their money work for them. The National Bank was one of the issues that brought Andrew Jackson later on to the presidency, and his refusal to charter the second bank created a huge financial crisis in the country. Anyway, so Hamilton's plan was simple. Reward the people with money and allow them to borrow more to create businesses that would be able to compete on a global stage. To get the moneyed people on board and establish faith in the government to handle the monetary foundation, he proposed paying 6% on all the bonds from the Revolutionary War. They were bonds to fund the war. There were scripts. There were promises to pay soldiers that hadn't been paid. Some of the states had issued some paper to raise money. So there's all this debt floating around. And what Hamilton proposed was to bring them all under the federal government and pay 6% interest. Now, some of those bonds, some of those that paper had already been sold at deep discounts because the government under the Articles of Confederation was unable to pay the interest on those loans, let alone the principal. The Articles of Confederation didn't give the federal government the power to issue a tax. And so basically what they did is they went to the 13 states and said, we need some money to run the government. Pretty please, would you give it to us? And of course the states had their own things to do, and so the answer was nearly always no. Not only did the bonds suffer, but payment owed to soldiers from the war were worthless, and some of those soldiers in desperation had sold their wages, the paper that owed them wages, at fractions of their face value. The moneyed men, taking a chance, a bit of a gamble, that the government would eventually agree to pay something close to the face value, they had kind of bilked the original owners. At least that was the Jefferson idea. Hamilton's plan or scheme, a schema, a process, something that all works together, incorporated both Congress's debt and state debt. Offering shares of the bank, which could only be purchased by the moneyed men because of the cost of the thing, he constituted an institution that could lend money, pay interest, and settle down the public so they didn't feel like they would starve. To Hamilton and Washington, this financial system was the second leg of the new government. But the plantation owners in the South felt left out. They didn't let their money support them. They were farmers. Of course, if you look at that a little closer, the farmers were being supported by slaves who they weren't paying. Now, the Southerners and their fellow Republicans, it's actually Democratic Republicans, to them it seemed like the Federalists had the entire government in the palm of their hands. The Federalists controlled Congress, they held the executive office, and the court backed the laws that they passed. It seemed a little bit like a fix. Congress passed and the president signed the Alien and Sedition Acts. To the Federalists, this was how the system was supposed to act. Congress passes bills, the president carries them out, regardless of how Adams felt about the situation. He wouldn't sign an executive order to do what the acts accomplished. That wasn't his concept of executive orders. If the Congress wouldn't have passed the bill, he would never have made them all by themselves. Now, we can see from our slide here that there's a couple of other things. James Madison felt that the Constitution didn't give the national government the power to create this bank. They should be separate. He considered that Hamilton had far overreached his power, and that on purpose he left the southern, read slaveholding states, out of the bank. The Republican, remember this, the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson and Madison, expressed their point of view in major cities along the way. Now, the Alien Acts had no sunset date, and its act, largely unmodified since 1798, allows the president to detain and deport non-citizens in times of a declared war or presidentially proclaimed invasion or predatory incursion by a foreign nation or government. You'll notice the reading there. It's not by individuals, but rather by a government. The law permits the president to target a broad swath of non-citizens, including natives, citizens, denizens, or subjects of the hostile nation or government. It doesn't distinguish between non-citizens who are unlawfully present and non-citizens with established legal status, like permanent residents, holders of a green card, holders of a work permit. In today's world, that would also be people who are here on a student visa. Nor does the law distinguish between loyal and disloyal citizens. The Enemy Aliens Act does not require the president to establish or even believe that the detained or deported non-citizens pose a threat to national security. It is enough that the non-citizen was born in and has the passport of this wrong country that we're at war with. Now, this is still the law. My notes say it's been used 3 times. I'm recording this late because of some technical difficulties, and it's actually March of 2025, and so now it's been used 4 times because President Trump has just used it over the weekend, and there are some court conflicts with what he did. Each involved, except for the new one, a declared war. The War of 1812, Britain declared war on the U.S. The U.S. declared war back. World War I, a declaration of war against Germany, originally Italy, and other Central Powers, and World War II, where we declared war against the Axis powers. The law was a key authority behind the ignominious policy of Japanese internment. We talked about that in the fall, as well as a lesser known internment in that World War II of German and Italian people. In the 1990s, the Supreme Court refused to address the issue, noting it was the responsibility of the other 2 branches of government to work out the act of war and what to do during the part of war. They seem to hold the position that without any military aspect, migration by itself is not an invasion. That's what we'll see playing out here in the next couple of months, because President Trump's actions on the weekend of March the 15th, there's no declaration of war. And so we're going to see this played out again. Now, the Sedition Act authorized the punishment of any person, we've already read this, who was printing false, scandalous, or malicious writing against the Congress or the president if it was intended to defame or to bring them or either of them into contempt or disrepute, and to cause the people of the United States to dislike them, to hate them. The overriding issue at stake here was the emerging definition of what it meant to be an American and how that should translate to governing the new nation. Since the second and third administrations, the ones that we're concerned with today, were largely decided by a geographical divide between North and South, let's take a moment and look at the general attitude between the 2 regions of the country, New England and the South. Now, I put up here something that reflects the New Englanders' point of view. Their view of republicanism was bound up with their idea of piety and morality, and their belief that the United States was a national organic community. They were striving to build a Christian Sparta. Remember, Sparta is the democracy from ancient Greece. Government to the New Englander should play a positive and active role in the guiding of the nation toward economic and moral health. Americans, they believed, had a moral obligation to live industrious, hard-working, frugal lives and to resist seduction or corruption by the pursuit of wealth. This is from American Politics in the Early Republic by James Rogers Sharp, a history professor at Syracuse. Now, the Republicans, who are primarily from the South, had a different view about what America was and what it meant to be an American. The overwhelmingly rural and isolated Southern society, with its plantation economy that was based on slave labor, and it was controlled by elites in local institutions. And this was a big contrast with what we just read. The primary instrument of local government in Virginia, and this is kind of the situation of the other southern states, was in the county court, which that institution reflected a deferential, hierarchical society ruled by gentlemen. Now that's a really fancy way to say that if you were caught, then you deferred or you did whatever the gentlemen, because they were smarter and richer, whatever they said. The county court had wide powers. It included legislative, executive, and judicial functions. The Southern County Court was in many cases insulated from the people's will. In Virginia, for example, the judges were not elected, but they were appointed by life terms by the governor. And he generally accepted the recommendation for the continuing of local justices in filling their agencies. So this is kind of the classic situation of the good old boys getting together and deciding who should be the next judge. Southerners took a libertarian view and recoiled in horror from the idea that government might be called upon to intervene in the lives of individuals to regulate their behavior according to any kind of moral values. Of course, they knew slavery was an immoral thing all by themselves, and so the idea that the government might come in and start dictating their morality to them was abhorrent. Slavery was also an important factor in the South in ensuring equality among the white citizens, because the elite believed that they could never safely preach equality in a slave society. For the elite believed they could more safely preach equality in a slave society than a free one. Small as well as large farmers had a common identity. They were common and both equal because they were not slaves. So now with these two essential differences in mind, here's some important points that affected the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts and then resulted in the defeat of Adams for his second term. So here are some of the issues. Once again, we looked at the French Revolution and how it caused a division in the public opinion. The administration, the vice president was working against the president. The opposition supported the constitutional form of government, but the Democratic Republicans disagreed with the way the administration was handling it, and they thought that the Federalists were out to ruin the Union. So what happened? Several Republican newspaper editors were jailed for speaking against the administration's program. Jefferson, who was not only in part responsible for providing language for some of those papers, but he was certainly responsible to create a movement to oppose the Alien and Sedition Acts. He also, though, provided assistance to the families for some of the people who were jailed, because everyone who was jailed, was part of his new Democratic Republican Party. They were the ones, after all, who disagreed with what the Adams administration was doing, and the Alien and Sedition Acts were specifically written to silence them. Jefferson and Madison, they formed this new party and really established the two-party system. But Jefferson also went a step further, and he established the states' rights doctrine in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. It's his opinion that if a state doesn't agree with what the federal government is doing, then they can leave the government, become an independent country. Now, Matthew Lyon was one of the newspapermen who ended up in jail for 4 months. He had accused Adams of being a monarchist. He also wrote a tract while he was in jail. But later on, after it was all over, he was returned to Congress. In fact, every one of them, a Republican writing against these acts or the administration. Jefferson showed his preference with the arrest and imprisonment of Thomas Callender. While he was in prison, Jefferson and John Taylor raised money for his defense. Here's a couple of other things that people were arrested for. Luther Baldwin mentioned in a public place that he didn't mind if Adams was shot in the arse. Baldwin was drunk, but they threw him in jail anyway. The editors of the New York Timepiece, Boston's Independent Chronicle, Bennington's Vermont Gazette, the New London, Connecticut Bee, Upstate New York's Mount Pleasant Register. Every one of these were voices for the new Republican Party. Every one of them printed something that was against the Alien and Sedition Act and questioned whether the president was acting in the nation's interest. And so reporters, printers, they were jailed. Now, along the way, and with Jefferson, even though he was the vice president, he actually spent quite a bit of that term not in Washington. You know, the vice president oversees the Senate, but their meeting and their time in Washington wasn't the same as it is now. Jefferson turned to the state governments. He asked his friend James Madison to write a bill for the newly formed state of Kentucky, and it said that in passing the Alien and Sedition Acts, Congress was exercising a power that the Constitution didn't give it, and they argued it also violated the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech. In Virginia, Jefferson took his conversations with and the Kentucky resolutions, and he went a step further, and he said the states voluntarily joined the Union, and they could also voluntarily withdraw their joining the Union. This became known as the states' rights doctrine, and that's what the spark that actually started the Civil War was when South Carolina withdrew their consent and started a new government. So the extent then of the Federalist loss of power is reflected in the 36 ballots that are needed to choose a president in the House in those days. Both candidates who were tied were from the same Democratic Republican Party. Adams wouldn't return to the office. The top two vote getters were tied. Adams was well behind them. And in fact, the Federalists would never have control of the Congress or the presidency again. By the time that Adams's son, John Quincy Adams, became the president, he was a Federalist. If you look at the reports of presidents and their parties, you'll see that he's a Federalist. But by the time that he became the president, the party didn't exist anymore. It was called the Whigs. The election went to the House because there was a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who was put forward in the candidacy as Jefferson's vice president. But Burr, seeing that maybe he had more support than he thought, in the beginning he was okay to be vice president. But when they tied, all of a sudden he decided, no, I could be the president, and he wouldn't back down. And so they went through they went through many ballots until finally Thomas Jefferson became the third president, and then again, of course, the fourth president. And Aaron Burr became his vice president. It was, by the way, during that time period that he shot and killed Alexander Hamilton. So there we are, the Alien and Sedition Acts, really about whether or not you can speak against the government, and if your First Amendment rights hold in that time period. And second, about the creation of the political parties, which of course we still live with now. In fact, if you're not a Democrat or Republican, the odds of you becoming the president in current society are all but impossible. And the only thing a third party candidate has ever done is throw the election to the party that he had come from. Perhaps the most famous of those is Teddy Roosevelt, who threw the election away from Howard Taft when he split away from the Republicans, started a party called the Bull Moose Party. All that really did was divide the Republican vote, which is how Woodrow Wilson became the president, the first Democratic president after the Civil War. So in February, we're going to talk about the Immigration Act of 1924. So I hope that you will join us then. The Immigration Act of 1924 was the first time that the government passed a large bill specifically designed to stop immigration. So we'll take a look at that next time.